Happy Sunday, everyone, and happy almost New Year's Eve as we head into 2025 and think about the new year, reflect on the last year. I wanted to do a brief musing analyzing the year-over-year usage of changing Mormon catchphrases. You know what they are. There's a long list. We got a bunch to quickly get through. We're talking covenant path, think celestial, lift where you stand, ponderize, and all the rest. I've long wondered about the ebb and flow of these catchphrases, how they kind of burst into popularity and then crater. But I never dug up the data. So today we're going to be sharing a few charts. For those of you listening to the audio-only version, I'll just talk through it so that you can listen along. And we're going to explore how these catchphrases have been changing in their use over time, and then perhaps a little musing to cap it off about what that means or why we should even care. Let's dig in. Before we dig in, this whole thing reminded me, I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen this clip used. I don't know what the movie is called, but here's the clip. You've seen it too.
That is so fetch. Gretchen, stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen.
Right, she's trying to make this thing a thing, right? And let's try and popularize this term. And clearly there have been many cases in the church where these terms are kind of used in general conference or whatever, and everyone starts using the term because, oh, that's what the leaders of the church are using, and then it kind of fades and fizzles and goes the way of fetch. How about covenant path? This is one that we've been hearing a lot about recently in general conference from leaders of the church. Is this a long-used term? Well, here's the graph. Clearly, absolutely not. 3 references in the 2000s. This goes decade by decade, by the way, starting from the 1900s and moving forward is when I gathered the data. 3 references in the 2000s, 106 in the 2010s, and then 171 in the 2020s so far. Keep in mind that we're only wrapping up 2024. This data is inclusive of the October 2024 General Conference, but that's only, 4 years in, right? So, well, I guess 5 if you're including 2020, right? That's how I did it. So 5. So this is halfway through the decade. Halfway through the decade, and we're at 171 references to covenant path. On track to do, 3.5 times what was done last year. But clearly this is a brand new thing, and everyone's talking about covenant path, and that's the term du jour that we are all using. And then it gets into the manuals and the lessons until the next one comes in. So this is kind of odd about our culture, but let's keep going through it. Here's the next one, another recent one that has burst into recent popularity. Think celestial. There is one reference back in the 70s, just randomly. And then in the 2020s so far, we've got 44 references. So, of course, what happens is, President Nelson comes out and he does his talk, think celestial. And then what happens in the next general conference? Everyone regurgitates it, right? Oh, just like President Nelson counsels us to think celestial. And then this is how these terms often get used, is that they'll kind of have their echoes, their reiterations, and then unless that president of the church, or pioneer church leader is continuing to push it, it kind of, starts to die off. So 44 references so far, no doubt more to come in the 2020s. How about an old one? Every member a missionary. Every member, and I searched. I did like every member is a missionary. Like this isn't so literal that it's only the exact phrase. So every member missionary. Interesting and unsurprising here. You get a peak in usage in the 60s, a little bit in the 40s. 2 in the 40s, 1 in the 50s. But then all of a sudden the 60s, right? We get the president of the time saying every member missionary, and then everyone's doing it. Trickles down in the 70s, and then it's a smattering into the 80s, 90s. 2000s and 2010s. So again, clearly a prominent leader of the church using the term. Others around him use the term to regurgitate and reinforce, and then it's a trickle from there. Another one that we've been hearing recently is this term prophetic counsel. I've talked about this in past musings. My issue with this term, because something is either prophecy or it isn't. A man is only acting as a prophet when acting as such, according to founding prophet of the restored gospel, Joseph Smith. So just because someone is the president of the church in the administrative capacity, and we sustain that individual as a prophet, seer, and revelator, that does not mean that he is or has issued any prophecy or has seen or revealed anything. The potential thereof exists, right? But it's not like a guarantee that it's happening. So prophetic counsel is kind of a misnomer because it's trying to turn the counsel of a president of the church into being perceived as prophetic when it's neither claimed to be nor actually is. So I've got issues with the term, but let's look at its usage. In fact, this is not a brand new thing as I initially theorized. We got one reference back in the 60s, and then a little bit in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, and then the most so far in the 2020s. So it is, more popular more recently. It is a term of choice by Elder Rasband in particular, but it's not necessarily a new term. It is a new-ish term with, modest references until this decade so far, where we're on track to do, 3 times more than a past decade by the end of the 2020s if the rate continues. What about a well-beloved term in the church that was on all the rings that we get as primary kids? You probably got one too. Left a little like colored band on your ring because of the metal alloy or whatever. CTR, choose the right. What has been the usage of this term? Well, for that we're going back to the 1910s. There were none in the 1900s, but 3, 1, 5, 3, 9, scattered references in each of the decades, going up to the 60s when we get a little burst, 18 there. Again, 9, 7 in the 70s and 80s. But now we're getting into the 1990s when I'm in primary, right? Yeah, I'm in primary. And I'm getting my CTR ring because I got baptized, and that's like right when it's happening. And there's 27 in the 90s, 27 in the 2000s, and then it's tapering down in the 2010s and the 2020s, 16 and 4. So heaviest usage in the 90s and 2000s, choose the right, but minor references, throughout the entire 20th century. What about another one that is scriptural, which is endure to the end? This is one I theorized, or I felt like going into this, okay, endure to the end, you don't really quite hear that as much anymore. I remember hearing it more growing up. So here's the data on endure to the end. Again, this one's starting back in the 1900s, no doubt because it has, scriptural basis. We get 4, 11, 6, 2, 9, 15. So, some modest references in all the decades from the 1900s to the 1950s. But then we get into the 60s. Starts to grow, 33 in the 70s, 37 in the 80s, 60, 69, and then 53 in the 2010s. So pretty heavy usage from the 60s, most heavily in the 90s and the 2000s, which comports with my theory about hearing it more when I was like a kid and a teenager about enduring to the end. And so far in the 2020s with 17, that means we're on track to do 34 by the end of the decade, which would be about the same back in the 60s and 70s. Still, decent usage, but not so heavy as the 90s and the 2000s in particular. How about follow the prophet? We sing it in primary, right? We haven't sung it back in the 1800s. Like I don't have the data, I didn't pull it up, but in the past musing, I've talked about, who wrote that primary song and how he was commissioned to and why he did it. And now it's the propaganda in our primary classes. So follow the prophet is a newish term of choice by leaders of the church in General Conference. We have 2 references in the 40s, 1 in the 50s, 5 in the 60s, 11, 4, 4, and then the most usage in the 2000s and the 2010s with 15 and 14. We're on track in the 2020s, 7 references so far, to be fairly consistent with the past 2 decades, the 2000s and the 2010s, about 14 or 15 references, which means on average you're getting 1 every other general conference or so, somewhere around there. Okay, so we had follow the prophet. What about our dear prophet? Our dear prophet. Because this is one I was like, because I'm thinking through, right? What are the terms to include in this little, musing, some stuff I can research. And I'm trying to think through the ones that are top of mind and then spend some time thinking, okay, what are the other ones? And Our Dear Prophet came to mind because you hear that a lot recently. Well, there was one reference in the 1910s. There was one reference in the 1940s. And that's it for nearly the entire 20th century. We get 2 in the 1990s, 2 in the 2000s, so still very modest, very infrequent. And then all of a sudden in the 2010s, we have 15 and then 19 so far in the 2020s. So we're on track to do 38, which is more than double what we did in the last decade. Well, Elder Razband has 28% of the references here, right? Because that's who I recall hearing it the most from, Elder Razband. And like, I swear, every talk he says Our Dear Prophet at least once. Elder Uchtdorf, 11% of the references. Elder Suarez, 14%. So it's like the newish, apostles are kind of using this reverential Our Dear Prophet term for the president of the church, and it's Razband is kind of pushing it and popularizing it with his, fellow younger, newer apostles. So Our Dear Prophet, fairly new. What about hastening the work? That was another one that I felt like is more recent, at least based on my own memory and experience. So I looked for, hastening his work, hasten his work, hastening the Lord's work, God's work, all those combinations. And, throughout the 20th century, hardly anything. One here, one there, and a few of the decades. We have 4 in the 90s, nothing in the 2000s, but then all of a sudden in the 2010s, we had 19. So, that decade was more emphatic with this term, hastening the Lord's work. We've got 4 so far this decade, so we're on track to do perhaps 8. But definitely this kind of in the 2010s, bunch of references, and then tapering back down. How about raise the bar? That was one, they've changed the missionary standards. They're trying to raise the bar. Perhaps not surprising that when they did that in the 2000s, we get 12 references, and then 3 in the 2010s, and that's it. There's no prior references. There's no references in this decade so far. So really, that was just during the 20,000s. How about another oldie? And one I thought of was lengthen your stride. Remember hearing that? Lengthen your stride. This one was really big in the 70s, burst onto the scene with nothing before it. Of course, because you got leaders of the church at the time using that. Wasn't that? I think it was McKay. I forgot to write down who it was. I think it was McKay. 29 in the 70s, 10 in the 80s, so already tapering off, 3 in the 90s, and then 2, and then 1. So this clearly, precipitous decline in the use of lengthen your stride. Okay, what about another one that is scriptural? Gather Israel. Like hastening the work, I feel like, okay, I've been hearing a lot more in recent decade or two about gathering Israel. Well, this is one, again, no doubt because it's scriptural, that we have a little tiny sampling in all the decades, pretty much throughout the 20th century. 3, 5, 6, 1, 2, 4, right? Each decade, just a little bit here and there. And then in the 2010s, we get 26. And then in the 2020s, so far, we get 45. So we're on track for 90, which is just massive. Now, some are going to be like, oh, that's because we're, finally gathering Israel. That must be a sign of the times and so forth, which, could be an interpretation. But it's clear that this term has picked up steam, used by the leaders of the church. One might conclude, based on the data from other terms, that in the decades to come, assuming the apocalypse doesn't happen before then, that we're similarly going to have a bit of a tapering off after the current leader of the church is less pushing the issue, and the new one has his own terms that start to be used and then repeated by everybody. What about lift where you stand, right? That was one from a general conference talk in the 2000s. So, of course, here's the data. You get 6 references in the 2000s, and then 2 in the 2010s, and then nothing. So this little modest blip on the radar, and then it's gone. Okay, how about tender mercies? This is like the Elder Bednar term of choice, right? And but again, a scriptural one. So looking at the data, again, no surprise, given its scriptural origin, we've got, again, just tiny references throughout the decades of the 20th century. 2 here, 4 there, 5 there, 1 there. And then in the 2000s, we get 43 references. Again, I'm looking at tender mercy, tender mercies. And then in the 2010s, we get 24 and then 9 so far. So again, in the 2000s, just this explosion of use of the term. Important to note, I dug into the data here. In the 2000s, when we have this explosion of references to tender mercy or mercies, Elder Bednar comprises 81% of the references in the 2000s. So of the 43 mentioned that decade, he's 81% of them. What's interesting to me is that in the following decade, when there's 24 references, Elder Bednar is none of them. He doesn't use it in the 2010s or after, right? He used it a bunch in the 2020s, or 2000s, excuse me, and then kind of popularized the term, and then has not used it since, but a bunch of like fellow apostles are all now using the term, although, again, tapering off. Thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, just a couple more to conclude. How about Ponderize? You remember this one? There was a bit of a controversy here because I think wasn't like a 70 or someone who used this term, and then like his son launched an apparel line and merch and stuff with Ponderize, and he was like primed and ready to go conference weekend to jump on this bandwagon of attention when this new term bursts onto our radar. Ponderize, of course, has never been a term ever until it becomes a term in the 2010s for which there were 10 references, and then nothing this decade so far. Let's do less kind of catchphrases, just a few little bonuses here. Secret combinations. How many references are we getting to that in General Conference by leaders of the church? Perhaps this chart won't surprise you that the most is in the 60s. For that, we can thank then Elder Ezra Taft Benson. But we got, 2, 3, 9 in the early 20th century. Biggest concentration in the 60s with 12, 5, 6, 8, and nothing this decade so far. Only 1 in the last decade. So it's like Elder Benson is like, hey, we got to talk about this. It's in the scriptures. Moroni warns us. I've done many amusing about this topic, and of course, recently about Ether 8, when we covered that in Come Follow Me, or rather did not cover that in Come Follow Me. Right? So Elder Benson's like, hey, we got to, pay attention. And then he's got a few references in the 70s and probably at least one of them in the 80s of the 6. But total tapering down. Only 3 in the 2000s, only 1 in the 2010s. Here's this like supremely important issue, and it's just not being talked about. Interesting. I also did a musing on abortion. So this will be a little repeat for those of you who heard that musing. I would encourage you to go listen to that musing in full, where I dig into the data far more than I'm about to share. Again, you can go to sundaymusings.org, and then in the drop-down, you can choose your topic. So you can pick abortion. You'll find the musing there. Abortion gets a ton of press, or rather airtime during General Conference in the 70s, when Roe v. Wade is, the big fight, the big court case. It's in the media. So church leaders prior to that basically say nothing. There's one reference in the 50s, one in the 60s, but this explosion in the 70s. Still quite a large number in the 80s and 90s, and then just a massive drop-off. Almost nothing since comparatively, which I find problematic for reasons that I share in that musing. Last one I'll share is the enabling power of the atonement. So that's, a more popular one in the 2010s. We get 1 in the 2000s, but again, like you get these little pop-ups, right? Someone comes up with this term that I was like, oh, that's a great term, and then everyone kind of catches on, except, within a few years, we've got the next term that we're doing. It's like this cyclical thing that we just, what's the latest one? What's the current church leader's catchphrase? We're all going to use that in kind of lockstep. Kind of interesting how these like cultural patterns ebb and flow, and some of them that are scriptural, as we saw, kind of have a little bit of a steady reference throughout, and then kind of a spike here and there of usage when a president of the church uses it or makes it kind of a central theme. But other than that, you get these like big peaks and then valleys, just totally cratering. So I find this interesting. This was more satisfying a personal curiosity than anything being this like substantive doctrinal exposition for I'm using, just to kind of observe, like, what do these patterns reveal? What does the data say? I was most surprised, I think, by Covenant Path, the first one I shared, just because the references have been like insanely huge. Went from nothing to 106 in the 2010s and then 171 so far in the 2020s. That's a lot. So that one was most surprising to me. A lot of these other ones were largely as expected, but it's kind of interesting to see it documented in some data and be able to kind of reveal how the stuff is working. What does that say? What does it mean? Again, I don't think anything necessarily substantive other than this might explain why maybe it's my kind of stubborn resistance, my anti-authoritarian, libertarian side or whatever, that it's like, I don't like, just like I still say Mormon. Right now I feel like the whole like, thou shalt not say Mormon is just because President Nelson said it. And, once he's gone and his kind of hobby issue is no longer, being pushed by its originator, like these references, that might, taper off. And then people will feel like more comfortable using the term once again and so forth. We just have these like weird things in our church culture dynamic where because the leader of the church, the president of the church is saying it this way, then we must all follow. But then the new leader comes in and has his own thing. So then we switch over here and we now do that thing instead. And all under the presumption that all of this is prophetic counsel or, we should follow the prophet and be like the prophet. And I don't know, it creates these weird, patterns in our culture that aren't necessarily harmful. I mean, I don't think there's any implicit harm in saying think celestial. I just kind of find it odd that as humans, we are social creatures. And in the church especially, there's like this spiritual layer on top of that where it's heavily reinforced to emulate the behavior and the terminology of a leader of the church who you sustain as prophet, seer, and revelator. I mean, it can get stupid and silly to like, okay, should we, like eat the same food they do and like make the same life decisions? Like, clearly not. No one really goes to that extreme, thankfully. But it's like, okay, well, let's resist these social waves that are trying to like move us around. And, it's like, I want to be on solid ground and say what I think is right and not be like, hey, do you know the newest lingo? It's like, I mean, my kids now are saying all the stupid like Riz and skibbity whatever and like all the latest terms that I can't follow. And maybe this is just being the old curmudgeon now that I am or whatever, where when I was young, I was using all the lingo. Interestingly, a friend and I were recently pondering how much the lingo's changed because growing up, everything was gay, or someone you didn't like was a fag or retarded. And it's like those terms have just like totally lost their usage. It's kind of interesting because at least growing up in San Diego, those were terms of choice like multiple times, not a day, probably an hour. It was heavily part of my lingo, and then it's changed. So, when I was young, I was a much more like socially influenced whatever, and maybe this is more just me getting a little old and firmer in my ways and resistant to what's the new popular, catchphrase. So what do you think about this? Are there any others that you'd like to see? Let me know in the comments. And maybe I can dig up a little bit more data, but I tried to be a little, comprehensive of the more common ones that we've all heard. I thought it was interesting, kind of fun to do a little research like that just to confirm some theories, see what's going on. But yeah, if I missed one that you really want to see, let me know, and maybe in the comments on the YouTube video. Be sure and leave a review as always on Apple Podcasts is where we do the reviews. So if you like listening, head over to Apple, make sure you're subscribed there. And you can leave a review as well. Hope you guys have a fantastic New Year's. I've got quite a number of musings planned that I'm excited for. So I love doing this. Appreciate you all listening. It's a fun project for me to do research and have an excuse to dig into things throughout the week and be thinking about all this. So I enjoy it. Appreciate you listening. I hope you have an awesome final few days of 2024, and I'll see you in the new year.